SEO, your social media manager. And joining us today, we have Chef Justin Cherry, owner of Half Crown Bakehouse and research fellow at the Washington Library. How are you today, Justin?
Very good.
Good, excellent. So Justin has been here at Mount Vernon, and he has been working on an 18th century cookbook project, and he's been testing a lot of 18th century recipes here in one of the kitchens of our administrative offices. Lucky for all of us here at the office. And he has kindly offered to show us and give us a cooking demonstration from one of the recipes he's been working on, which happens to be one of George Washington's favorite food, hoecakes. So before I turn it over to Justin to show us how it's done, just a reminder to ask us any questions that you have for Justin about 18th century cooking. I'll be looking through and asking them as they pop up. Tell us where you're watching from, and in the meantime, I'll turn it over to you, Justin.
All right, so what we're going to do today is make one of George Washington's favorite dishes, hoecakes with butter and honey.
Yum.
And they actually appear in a couple documents from Nellie Custis in the 19th century, and also a visit from Winthrop Sargent in the 1790s, who talks about eating them at breakfast time. So, as we get started here, the first thing I like to do is I like to use more of a modern approach to these hoecakes, and we're using buttermilk, which is about 2 cups.
2 cups buttermilk. Following along at home.
And a little trick is, the next ingredient is baking powder, and obviously that is different from 18th century ingredients, which they would have used either barm, which is the top of the yeast from beer, or they would have used potash, or they would have used no leavening at all, because the hoecake is basically a cooking term and dish from the Native Americans, and then it moved on to enslaved workers and African Americans, and even part of the middle class and lower class colonists at the time, because corn was readily available. So all those things combined, we'll put the baking powder in next, and what that'll do is that'll react with the acid in the buttermilk.
How much baking?
So about half a tablespoon.
Okay.
And then we'll put in a full tablespoon of salt. We'll stir that up. And then next I like to put in 1 egg to help with the richness. And then we'll add our cornmeal. You can use white or yellow. I like to use a white cornmeal. And the quality of the cornmeal is really what makes the hoecake and all of its flavor, because you want that flavor of corn.
Where'd you get this cornmeal from?
So this is from Anson Mills in South Carolina.
Okay.
And that's where I get all of my grains for Half Crown Bakehouse. They specialize in reviving 18th century ingredients, and all of their products are documented. Actually, I've done a lot of the research for documentation of them, and Glenn Roberts is the one who is the main guy at Anson Mills. So we will go over to the pan, and just right before we do that, we'll actually add about 2 tablespoons of bacon fat or lard, kind of your choice. And we'll stir that in as our fat to make these hoecakes nice and crispy. So once our pan gets hot, I suggest using a cast iron. The term hoecake actually has 2 origins, one meaning the hoe, which is the flat part of the tool, and or a griddle. The English term for hoe is also a griddle. And hoecakes also have many also alike terms that follow them, like Johnny cakes or journey cakes. Some are thicker. If we were being completely 18th century accurate, this would be more like a hot water cornbread, which is boiling waters poured into cornmeal, a little bit of fat, and that goes right on the hot griddle. All right. It's nice to hear that nice sizzle.
It already smells good. Somebody asked if we're making peanut soup. Sadly, no. That is an in item.
So you want to check your edges so they should be nice and crispy. And they'll start to brown around the edges a little bit. Over.
So Justin, we have a recipe for hoecakes on our website at mountvernon.org. Have you worked on it a little?
I think it is a little bit similar.
Okay.
It might differ in some of the ingredients.
Okay.
Some people like to put flour in theirs.
Okay.
To make it a little more substantial, plus hold it together a little bit better.
Nice.
But the egg and cornmeal do a fine job of that themselves.
Nice. Ooh, Zara has a good question. How did you get interested in historic cooking? I would also like to know that. Answer.
Well, as working in restaurants for about 12 years, I was also doing French and Indian War reenacting and American Revolutionary War reenacting. And the two of those sort of took up most of my time, more of the restaurant life on the weekends. And I couldn't reenact anymore, so after working at a few restaurants and considering my options, I wanted to combine both of those things, history and cooking. So I started doing lots of research and primary source documentation on what they ate, what they had, and sort of the love of the two things brought it together. And actually I formed my business, Half Crown Bakehouse, after that decision.
Yeah, and I didn't actually mention, which we probably should, how can people find Half Crown Bakehouse? Where are you located?
Well, we are a mobile operation. I have a full 18th century oven that's built on a trailer, but when set up at historic sites, it looks completely accurate in the form of its clay oven style. And I traveled to a lot of historic sites on the East Coast, and Mount Vernon being one of those stops. And all throughout Pennsylvania and Virginia. And I do farmers markets as well in Charleston, South Carolina, where we're based.
Well, Penny is just joining us. She said, catch up for latecomers. What are we making? Good reminder.
We're making hoecakes. We're making hoecakes, and actually they're about done.
Oh, man.
So George Washington loved to eat them with a description from Nellie Custis later in the 19th century describes it as swimming in butter and honey. So we're going to do that as well, because I think it's nice to be accurate on documentation on what she said.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just heating a mixture of honey and butter together, which it's about a quarter cup of butter melted and a quarter cup of honey. So it almost pools on the plate.
Wow. So a health food.
Definitely.
That's what you're saying, yeah.
All right, well that warms up. We have our plate over here.
Whoa.
We have a nice stack of the hoecakes.
Wow, you can actually see, you can kind of see the grains of
Yeah, you should be able to
cornmeal.
smell the corn.
Here, I'm wafting it to you guys. Sorry we don't have smell vision yet. That is a bummer.
All right, so we'll take our honey and butter mixture.
I would not have thought to combine the honey and the butter.
I feel like his were probably separate, but for the home cook, this is a little easier.
One pot only. Whoa.
So he liked them swimming, so we're just going to do that as well.
Who cares about 2020 resolutions?
They're out the door. So yeah, if you want to
get to try. Whoa, they're crunchy. Oh my god, they were practically fried in there. Whoa. Should put my phone down. Oh my god.
Oh, that's great.
That's amazing.
Yeah, the crispiness of the corn really comes through.
Yeah.
And the butter and honey, they sort of soak it up, which I bet George was a fan of as well because of issues with his teeth.
Wow.
Because there's thoughts of these actually being mush.
Right.
Almost like a fried mush instead of like a batter.
Huh.
So the butter and honey would sort of soak into that cake. And I think it would just, it kind of melts in your mouth.
Mm. Yes, it does.
It's really good. Corn really comes through.
I can see why that's one of his favorite foods. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I suggest anybody at home that when you're using your cast iron pan, that after it heats up a little bit, you can use butter, but that'll brown a little faster. I think a better way to do it is to use bacon fat and or lard. So this is definitely a diet food.
Totally, no problem. Penny asks, is the yeast risen? Is it a yeast risen recipe? And what is it? Jared asked what it is. These are hoecakes.
So these are hoecakes, and it can be yeast risen. If you're using yeast, I like to do about a teaspoon of yeast dissolved in about a quarter cup of water, and you would mix this the night before, and then put it in your fridge. Because it gives that yeast a chance to react, and it slows it down at the same time because most yeast is like instant yeast. So it'll react right away. So this will slow that process down a little bit. And then the next morning, just re-stir your batter, and you can go for it. Actually, it'll be a firmer cake. There'll be more of a crumb and more air bubbles in it. And it'll be less dense than this.
Yeah.
But like I said, this is cake that's both delicious and sort of easy to make. I mean, we just did it there in about 7 minutes.
Yeah, I should have timed us. That was really easy.
Yeah,
You can easily do it on a Saturday morning.
Yep, and all the ingredients are readily available, especially lard. People don't look for lard, but it is in most grocery stores. Just look by the oils and fats.
The healthy areas of the grocery store. So I had mentioned that this recipe and other 18th century recipes you're working on for a cookbook project. Can you tell us more about that project and how we might be able to get these recipes?
Yeah, so the cookbook project is in a very early beginning phase. It's the testing phase of most recipes. And actually they started with a fellowship that I received from the Mount Vernon Fred W. Smith Library last year. And on that fellowship, I was studying foodways of the 18th century and how it affected Mount Vernon and how Mount Vernon foodways affected a greater picture, which includes everything from the grist mill, which sold flour and cornmeal. It opened in 1771, as well as Future in 1797. He opened a commercial distillery. So all those things have in mind and keep in mind with foodways. It affects the cultural economy, pretty much everything. So going through the ledgers and his diaries and all of his papers, I was able to pull different foods and more of looking at, not from his perspective, but other people that visited and dined with him, even in his time during the French and Indian War, even his time as a surveyor, and his trip to Barbados as well. He was really influenced by a lot of those foods and mannerisms when he went to Barbados in 1751. So all those things influenced his whole life of eating, and I wanted to put that into a book project. And so another fellow at the same time as me, my office mate George Goodwin, is co-authoring this book with me. And we want to look at both the history of Washington's life and where he dined. I mean, his only time outside of the colonies that were on land was a trip to Barbados, but he was in all 13 colonies through his northern tour and southern tour when he became president. So he had friends and connections, and and former generals and colonels and majors and all of those colonies once he became president. So he was making his tour down there and visiting and eating and dining very, very well. I know Charleston, Savannah, and Boston are one of the big cities that his dining, big banquets occurred. So all that put into a book with little anecdotes and little tips and tricks, but it's all 18th century recipes that are modernized for the kitchen at home. So.
Justin will be sure to let us know, and then we'll let you know when we can get our hands on that. So we're getting a few more questions. Mount Vernon for Teachers asked, what is the weirdest 18th century recipe you've made? There must be some pretty weird ones.
Yeah, there's some weird things, but I mean, I guess in today's culture, it's probably not looked at on as weird with, you know, the food craze the last 15 or 20 years. You know, tripe is probably one of them. I mean, people sort of tend to look away from tripe, but I find it very delicious. But tripe, honeycomb tripe being like beef stomach, that's kind of a weird one. Beef tongue was very big back then, both pickled and smoked.
Wow.
So that's, you know, it doesn't seem weird to me, but it might seem weird to other people.
Sure.
I mean, those are two off the top of my head.
Those are pretty good. Those are pretty weird. We'll have you make the tongue next time for us.
Yeah, and even actually, calf's head soup is another one where you take the whole head of a calf and you slow poach it, and then you pick the meat, and that's either made into a soup or it's kind of like a mold.
Huh. We'll put that on the schedule. Penny asked, where do we get this recipe? You touched on where this one came from.
Yeah, so this one, like I said, was mentioned in one of the visits by Winthrop Sargent, which was actually, he was with Washington during Braddock's expedition. But this visit happened in 1793. Also from Nellie Custis, his step-granddaughter. She wrote that in the 19th century, that he loved them swimming in butter and honey. But this recipe is actually, a lot of my work is based upon culinary archaeology, so it's seeing what sources you have available, seeing the region that we're in, and then pulling that together on what I know from being a cook and trying to think how they would have thought. You know, if I had this leftover fat, I probably would have used this. If you had buttermilk back then, which was, not everybody had buttermilk, but it was more of just like soured milk. It's milk that sat out because of no refrigeration. So our buttermilk is a lot different because it's pasteurized, so it might have been just regular milk sitting out. But yeah, it's a combination of all these things and a lot of testing. Some failures, some not, but you kind of get the gist of it after a while. And some of them do exist, and you know, works all throughout the 18th century of cookbooks. A lot of those being English. If you go back further to the 17th century, that's actually more a reliable source. I know Martha's Book of Cookery, that manuscript, that actually dates back to then, but it's included recipes all up until the 19th century. And that's a very good source because you can start to see a lot of plagiarism in the 18th century of cookbooks because there was little or no copyright back then. So, you know, if somebody had this in their manuscript, it wasn't more or less their recipe. It was maybe something that they copied from, you know, Hannah Glass's 1747 book or E. Smith's book. And all of those things. So actually the further back you go is probably the better. If you see those dishes in the 18th century, I suggest you go back further than the actual 18th and the 17th because most of those people just copied each other.
Yeah, I was going to say when you mentioned Hannah Glass, a lot of the recipes on our website at mountvernon.org/recipe are from that cookbook and the book that we have available at the shops at Mount Vernon, Dining with the Washingtons, is also some of it taken from there and from other Washington sources. We have a couple other questions before we devour this completely. Brenda would like to know what breads would Mrs. Washington supervise the making of, and And she also would like to know, what is suet and how would you cook with it?
Suet is more of like it's closer to like a beef fat. So they would actually, like, this is the other thing, like the fat, you can also use that. I mean, when people think of suet today, they think of what holds like bird food together.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And it's kind of unappetizing, but suet back then was more of a way to preserve other things. And people would top beef and pork with that and sort of seal it off so it would have no oxygen or air, and it would sort of preserve that. And it was also used for cooking.
Okay.
And for the bread question, there are documentation of the mansion receiving flour and Midlands, which is like the bran from the flour when it's sifted for household use. So they would use that, and he was known for a white wheat, which is white llamas wheat. And today we think of that wheat as more of a pastry flour, but back then, llamas culture was actually used for breads because of the strength of the grain. So they would use that, and I know that she would supervise the making of the white bread. So it's more of like a white bread, but it's definitely a yeasted bread, not like a sourdough. And they would make a sponge the night before using barm, like I said earlier, is from the top of beer, like the yeast that comes up, and they would combine that and flour and warm water and set that like next to the hearth, but not directly over it, sort of like to proof. Like when you put a hot towel over bread to proof. They would let that sit in the early morning hours. And I think Doll, an enslaved worker in 1759, she came to Mount Vernon, and she did a lot of the breads in those early years. And then definitely they would use that in the bake oven. And they'd work the dough. The sponge would be mixed with more flour the next morning until it was a workable surface, and then they would go back by the hearth and it would sit until it raised, and then they would fire it into the oven, which would be heating up most of the night and the day. I don't think it ever stopped. And they would shovel the coals out from the actual oven, and then the oven surface would still be hot, and they'd close the door, put the bread in there, and you'd have bread about 35 to 45 minutes later.
Sounds good. Sounds pretty good. Susie would like to know what George's favorite dinner was. Do you know that one?
He doesn't quite talk a lot about food during his life. Early on he does, and a little bit later there's documentation of dinners. They don't exactly say what his favorite dinner was, but I know mutton chops was definitely a favorite of his, which in the 18th century that was like a gentleman's fast food. It was like going to McDonald's. You'd go to Christiana Campbell's Tavern in Williamsburg, and you get some mutton chops because they were quickly prepared, really fast over a hot fire.
Interesting. There you go. George Washington, McDonald's mutton chops. No, Penny wanted to know the most unusual or your favorite vegetable recipe.
That's kind of a tough one. Actually, today I was testing a recipe using carrots and potatoes into a custard, which was more like it was a carrot pudding. It would have been, carrots would have been grated and then combined with the custard with egg yolks and milk and cream until a thick cream formed. And then you take those cooked grated carrots and potato, and then you would fold that into the custard itself, and then it would be baked in a slow oven until kind of like almost like a creme brulee sort of top would form onto it. That's one of my new favorites for sure.
Is that the one you tested today?
Can
confirm that one is excellent. Brenda says, I know one of George's favorite foods were oysters. That is true.
Yeah.
And she also asked, so Brenda's one of our character interpreters here. She says she's interpreted the enslaved community children as eating things like hominy and buttermilk for breakfast. Does that sound plausible or correct to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, buttermilk. I know there was, at one time, there was buttermilk given out, and hominy, and definitely hoecakes and salted fish, for sure.
Yeah, okay. Good to know. And Dean is just joining us. He says that the Mount Vernon veggies from the historic gardens are amazing.
They are.
He may or may not be the one in charge of the historic gardens at Mount Vernon. We'll make sure you get in next, Dean. But that was so great. Thank you. I think we probably let these hoe cakes go too long without eating them, so I think we should probably head out. But thank you so much for joining us today, Justin. That was so fun and delicious. And as we mentioned, you can keep an eye out for Justin's cookbook project coming down the pike. You can also see him when you come to Revolutionary War weekend this May, the first weekend in May in Mount Vernon. He'll be here with the Half Crown Bakehouse oven. And we'll make sure these hoe cakes don't go to waste. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you guys.
Bye.